All right, peace, family. A lot of us know. I'm gonna start by saying this is still another part of the series that I'm doing on exposing these U.S. presidents. But a lot of people go to the Declaration of Independence, but not talk about the views that the drafter of the Declaration of Independence stated. I mean, this guy opens up and says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." That's what the drafter or the author of the Declaration of Independence said. But while he was saying this, while he was going there and saying this nonsense, this is what he was doing. Starting in 1767, at the age of 24, Jefferson, he inherited, because these people didn't own anything. They didn't go out and work for anything, none of this stuff. But he inherited 5,000 acres of land and 52 slaves from his father's will. In 1768, Jefferson began construction the Monticello plantation. Through his marriage to his wife, Martha, in 1772, and his inheritance from his father-in-law, John Wells, in 73, Jefferson inherited 2 plantations and 135 slaves. By 1776, Jefferson was one of the largest plantations, was one of the owners of the largest plantations in Virginia. But they talk about how he couldn't free his slaves because of his debt. The debt was too great, because they're trying to humanize these slave owners, and because it's not like these people couldn't get their life back. Their life came and went as slaves of Thomas Jefferson. So it's no excuse for it. It's no humanization of it. That's genocide. He killed them people and stripped their life, stripped their culture from them. He was a part of that same system. But let's see where we're going. His views on race. Because I can prove that these guys always wanted us to be in an inferior role to them. But it says in his notes, Jefferson's contemporarily described blacks as inherently fixed nature, inferior to whites in critical reasoning and beauty, but superior in musical ability. So he said basically that's what we got over them is musical ability. Jefferson believed that the bounds of love for blacks were weaker than those for whites. According to one scholar, William Pitton, this idea about fixed nature was Jefferson's rationalized justification for a racial caste of slavery. So it was his way of making slavery legitimate in his mind. But in 1808, the French abolitionist and priest Henry Baptiste sent Jefferson a copy of his book, An Inquiry Concerning the Intellectual and Moral Fallacies and Literature of Negroes. In his text, he responded to and refuted Jefferson's argument of African inferiority in notes on Virginia, citing the advanced civilization Africans had developed as evidence of their intellectual competence. Jefferson basically replied and said African Americans shouldn't depend on the intellect of Africans. Africans had respectable intelligence, and the African Americans shouldn't depend on that. But he went into and said that your ability to think shouldn't go with your rights. Talking about Isaac Newton was smart, but he didn't own other people. He basically make him know other people and all this stuff. But as we do, we go back into the Seminoles. Thomas Jefferson played a part in this too. After 1790 negotiations with the United States, Spain no longer granted freedom to fugitive slaves running into their territory. Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, was instrumental in forcing Spain to give up its 1693 edict, granting refuge for runaway slaves. The 1790 treaty with New York, the Treaty of New York with the Creek tribes, the first treaty in U.S. history, is not the first treaty in U.S. history. The first treaty in U.S. history is the Treaty of Morocco, but I guess maybe they first U.S. treaty with tribes of the U.S. The first treaty was one of many successful measures that turned the Lower Creek into slave-raiding allies of the United States. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, two founding fathers who were told laid the foundations of the free world, were engaged in destroying the only beacon of freedom that existed for African slaves in the South. Regardless, Spain's tenuous hold on Florida allowed slaves to escape from Georgia and Carolina plantations and disappeared as they crossed the Oconee River into Seminole territory. So this is what Thomas Jefferson was trying to do. Thomas Jefferson not only owned all of these slaves on his plantation, built some, inherited some, so he had all of these slaves. He was lying about all men being created equal. He said that himself, that he thought whites was basically superior than the Negroes, and he even got foreign leaders trying to talk him out of it and everything. They try to make it seem like, oh, he was against slavery, but he had it. He had slaves. And not only did he have slaves, but when they tried to run away, he put out slave ads for their recovery, run away from the I guess they F's are kind of like a S or something like that. So it's like Sabrar and Elmore, a mulatto slave from Sandy, called Slandy, about 35 years old. His stature is rather low. So it goes into a description. So if they saw this guy, they could basically bring him back to the plantation, because it wasn't no freedom. There wasn't no liberty for blacks. It was only liberty for the white man at the black man's expense and at the natives' expense. These people was full of themselves. That's all they was worried about, was themselves, the interests of the United States, just like they are worried about now. And the interest is always going to be white interest, because it's a system of white supremacy. So that's all I really got on Thomas Jefferson, man. He was a slave owner. And oh, one more thing. Thomas Jefferson actually knew who the native people was, because he said to understand the American Indian language, a man must be fluent in Arabic. He said that you should use Arabic and these basically Iberian languages to get an understanding of what was going on over here. He actually sent Lewis and Clark over here across the land with a guy named York, a Negro slave named York, who I'm pretty sure spoke Arabic. But this is Thomas Jefferson, man. He knew who was over here. He wanted these people enslaved. He didn't want Florida to be a safe haven for black people, because it was against their interests of slavery, because it's a slavery society. Slave was an institution. So that's basically, the global economy was dependent on slavery. And Thomas Jefferson was a part of it. But peace, family.